Herzlich willkommen. Die heutigen Vorträge und die anschließende Podiumsdiskussion finden auf Englisch statt. Also jetzt wäre der richtige Zeitpunkt, wenn Sie einen Kopfhörer für die Dolmetschung brauchen, dass Sie ihn sich holen. Ansonsten geht es jetzt in Englisch weiter. Good evening. My name is Fanizadeh, and I'm coordinator at the VIDC, responsible for migration and development, and with a regional focus on the Middle East. I would like to welcome you all to today's discussion, Afghanistan, 6 months after the disaster, the catastrophe, the tragedy. I'm really delighted to welcome so many participants in person after such a long COVID break here at the Diplomatic Academy in Vienna. And I'm also pleased to welcome the viewers on the Facebook pages of the VIDC and the Danish Refugee Council. I'm extremely happy to welcome our distinguished speakers, Heela Najibullah and Horia Mosadiq. Welcome to Vienna. And I welcome Jared Rowell, which is digital connected to us. Welcome, Jared. Today's event will be moderated by Ali Ahmad, who will also briefly introduce our speakers later. Welcome, Ali. Ladies and gentlemen, give peace a chance. That is how any event must start today. The terrible and dangerous war in the Ukraine has also pushed events and fears in Afghanistan out of the headlines. And it's good and right that the Austrian Minister of Interior has reacted quickly and wants to help refugees from Ukraine and accept them in Austria. Austria's attitude towards refugees from other countries, and especially from Afghanistan, is less positive. By announcing that no refugees will be accepted directly from Afghanistan, none of the refugee children, women, or old people stuck in Pakistan, Iran, or elsewhere, Austria has not followed a human rights-based approach. No one should come, and certainly not directly from Afghanistan, where thousands of people are in urgent need of our help, especially women and girls. Even now, there are supposed to be no visas in Austria for people who are not Ukrainian citizens, even though they have fled Ukraine. This now applies against to Afghans and others who are stranded in the Ukraine. There must be no double standards and no racism in helping refugees. Solidarity must be for all. But back to our event. The situation in Afghanistan remains precarious. Many people suffer from hunger and poverty, and women in particular are affected by the Taliban's rigid and misanthropic policies. We will talk about this in detail with our distinguished guests. But before I hand over to our moderator, I would like to take this opportunity to express my sincere gratitude to my colleagues at VIDC, who have been very active in helping me to organize and carry out today's event, especially Irene Hochauer-Kpoda and Lisa Buksch. Thank you. This event will take place in cooperation with the Danish Refugee Council and is supported by the Austrian Development Corporation as well as the Deutsche Gesellschaft für internationale Zusammenarbeit, GIZ, on behalf of the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. Thanks especially to the colleagues of the Danish Refugee Councils for the very good cooperation. They are with us connected via Facebook. A special thanks goes also to the Afghan associations AKIS, Neuer Staat, Afghan Wulas, IGASUS, and IEZ for the excellent cooperation and support, like always. As I said before, today's talk and discussion will be held in English and translated in simultaneous into German. I would like to take this opportunity to thank Mrs. Gallo and Mr. Musil, our interpreters today, for their difficult work. Thank you. In the questions and answer session later on, please feel free to raise your questions in English or German. Finally, please switch off your mobile phones, and I would like to draw your attention to our feedback forms, which I ask you to fill in after the event. You find the feedback forms on your chairs. Now there is not much left for me but to wish us an exciting evening and to hand over to my colleague Ali Ahmad. Ali is a PhD candidate at the Department for Migration and Globalization at the Danube University in Krems. He received his master's degree in Peace and Conflict Studies from the European Peace University and has been working as a consultant for the VIDC since 2015. He has written many research papers on Afghan refugees and diaspora communities in Europe, which I cannot list all here, but you will find some on our website of the VIDC. Ladies and gentlemen, give peace a chance. This also applies to everyone, but also to Afghanistan and Afghans. But a real peace, with rights and freedoms for all, for the majority, for the minorities, as well as for children, men and women. Thank you, Ali. The floor is yours.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I hope everyone can hear me loud and clear. Assalamu alaikum, Sharaglas, welcome. Khosh Amaded. Michael said, give peace a chance. There is no harm in giving peace a chance. The aggression on Ukraine reminds us of Russia's aggression and invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. And Afghanistan has not recovered from that aggression so far and is still burning in conflict. From my side as well, I would like to welcome everyone who is attending today's event, 6 months after the disaster when the Taliban took over on the 15th of August last year. Thank you, Michael, for your kind introduction and for your generous words of solidarity with all refugees of all kinds, and particularly the support that Afghan diaspora received from the VIDC throughout these last several years has been tremendous, and I'd like to thank you, Michael, and the VIDC team for their support. This is, as Michael said, this is a hybrid event, and this will be broadcasted live on the VIDC and DRC Facebook pages, and we are happy to see so many of you today here, and so many people are tuning in from different parts of the world, and I'd like to thank everyone who's joining, who's watching us on Facebook Lives, and also who are attending today here. My warm welcome also to our panelists, dear panelists and guests, for taking the time to travel to Vienna and enlighten us, the audience, about Afghanistan and what is going on in Afghanistan. I will introduce the panelists in a minute. And the environment today that we see with so many attendants, it's just encouraging, because on Afghanistan we didn't have such an event because of the COVID. The discussion will take place with our speakers, and I miss to welcome Jared Rowell. Sorry, Jared, who is connected online from Kabul. He's the director of Danish Refugee Council, the country director. I'll introduce him also in a bit. To my right, Heela Najibullah is a PhD candidate at the Religious Studies Department of University of Zurich and has done her master's degree in peace, conflict transformation, and security studies at the University of Innsbruck. She's also the author of a book, Reconciliation and Social Healing in Afghanistan, and she has a decade-long work experience on migration issues with the International Federation of Red Cross. Thank you, Ms. Najibullah. And on my left is Horia Mosadiq. She's an Afghan human rights defender and journalist with around 26 years of work experience in Afghanistan and South Asia in the fields of human rights, peace, justice and reconciliation, transnational justice, gender security, and violent extremism. She's a well-known and well-respected woman human rights defender in Afghanistan and the region. In 2007, Ms. Mosadiq won the Afghan Human Rights Award, and in 2011, she was named one of the 50 most courageous women in the world by Britain's Glamour magazine. Amnesty International gave her the Women's Rights Defender Award in 2012 and 2015, and the Open Asia Armand Shahar Foundation recognized her for her outstanding commitment to human rights in 2015. Welcome, Ms. Mosadiq. And Jared Rowell, who is the country director of the Danish Refugee Council in Afghanistan, as one of the largest international NGOs in Afghanistan. Rowell is responsible for a team of over 700 staff working in 18 provinces of the country across a range of sectors, focusing on humanitarian response and longer-term durable solutions. Prior to Afghanistan, Rowell worked for several years with Mercy Corps and regional roles in South and East Asia. He also worked in Jordan, Egypt, Kenya, and Tanzania. Welcome, Jared, and thank you for taking the time to be with us. Now to our topic, 6 months after the Taliban. So what is going on in Afghanistan from the humanitarian perspective? Without any further ado, I would like to ask Jared Rowell. We hear a lot of news about the humanitarian situation and humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan. And we, sitting in Europe, we see and we hear that the crisis in Afghanistan is a multi-layered crisis. Maybe you could tell us what are the humanitarian needs in Afghanistan. Please get us through to the situation. The floor is yours, Rowell.
Good evening. Thank you, Ali, and thank you very much to the VIDC for inviting me, and to all of the people participating in the event. Thank you for your interest in Afghanistan. It's a very sad situation here in the country, but we have a range of humanitarian organizations working very hard to provide as much support as possible during a very difficult time. I've prepared a brief presentation, which I'm going to upload now, and then give you, I think, a bit of an ability to show some of the updates through the visuals. I just think I need to be granted access as a host, and then I'll upload the slides. Great, thank you. So the situation in the country, I think, really requires a bit of a brief introduction first into DRC's work in Afghanistan. So DRC has been present in the country since 1999. We started off through our subsidiary, the Danish Demining Group, and we were primarily a mine action actor in Afghanistan for our first 10 years here in the country. Starting in 2011, DRC as an agency established its own operation, and the Danish Demining Group is now folded into DRC's work. We work in 5 out of 6 regions of the country in 18 out of 34 provinces, and we serve over 1 million people a year with our various activities and responses. We have approximately 700 staff, 25% of them are female. Unfortunately, it's not a higher percentage due to the fact that we have so many male deminers in our operation, and that affects our gender balance a little bit, but we've made progress in the last couple of years to improve our female staffing numbers. We have currently 12 international staff from different areas of the world. That's down from 19 compared to last year as part of an effort to nationalize our staffing. Since August, we've wanted to maintain a lower level of international staff presence and to promote Afghan voices into more senior leadership roles here at our organization. We are a dual mandate agency with emergency interventions and more durable solutions. So we do a mix of emergency responses that can last anywhere from 3 months to a year. And then we have longer term donor funded awards that can go upwards of 3 to 4 years. Although since August, donors have been primarily focusing on the shorter term emergency responses given the needs in the country. So as an agency, we focus on emergency response. That means we distribute a lot of cash. We give out cash-based assistance, and we also distribute non-food items. We're a protection actor where we monitor the vulnerabilities of people, particularly focusing on women, children, and other especially vulnerable populations, including ethnic minorities. We provide legal services and referrals. When we talk about referrals, it could be anything from helping women suffering from domestic violence to seek shelters to helping women and children get certain health access to services that they wouldn't get in their local communities. And doing child protection services, such as helping children access either formal or informal schooling. We're a humanitarian mine action actor. We do mine and explosive clearance operations. We educate communities on mine risks and how to avoid contaminated areas. And we do armed violence reduction interventions where we help communities resolve conflicts. We do early economic recovery. That means helping people diversify their livelihoods and incomes so that it's not solely reliant on one type of revenue stream. Since August, we've had to shift more to cash-based support around their livelihoods, meaning giving people cash in order to do certain work in their communities, like building roads or irrigation systems, and also diversifying and doing some vocational training. We also work in emergency shelter. There's been a lot of conflict in Afghanistan, which means there's been a lot of damage to people's homes. So we help communities construct homes, repair homes, prepare people's homes for winter, provide additional cash for their house-based needs, and also some shelter kit distribution, including fuel for the winter and ventilation, insulation for winter months in their homes. In 2022, we're also expanding into some emergency water, sanitation, and hygiene work, meaning that we're going to distribute hygiene kits and also implement water-based systems in communities like building wells. Since there's been some very severe droughts, we need to provide more access to water in communities as well. And we're also going to be focusing on food security since malnutrition is one of the largest emergencies currently affecting the country. So here's just a brief map to show you all of the different provinces in which we work. As you can see, we're very focused on the east, on the central region, the southern part of the country like Kandahar, the western part of the country, and then we have a smaller scale presence in the east and the north. So to highlight some of the humanitarian needs overview, but the largest, I think, emergency at the moment is food insecurity. That's the result of the very severe drought that the country underwent. We've had the worst drought in 37 years here in Afghanistan this past summer. We're still dealing with the effects of that. The political turmoil and takeover in August, and then the resulting economic crisis that came with the takeover and banks freezing all transfers and assets to the country. Over half of the population in the country, that's 22.5 million people, are currently food insecure. The UN has a categorization system, and those people, that half of the population, is either at IPC 3, which means they're in crisis, or IPC phase 4. 3.7 million people are at extreme risk. The highest IPC level is phase 5, which would be famine. And there is a risk that in 2022, certain communities and provinces of the country could reach famine status by the summer. So it's a very, very severe situation with regards to food. 21 provinces out of 34 are at high and medium risk. There's extreme wheat deficits, stress on livestock due to lack of access to food and water for the animals, and lower household food reserves. There's been a very long winter here this year, and people are very quickly running out of food options. We're also expecting a La Nina season this year, which would help with the rain, but would also destabilize the agriculture season as a result. The other major situation is the collapse of the healthcare system. At least 1,700 healthcare centers have closed throughout the country, particularly in rural areas, meaning that if there is a real severe health-related need for a household, particularly women and children, would have to travel very long distances in order to access a healthcare center in a more urban environment, which then increases the risks of women and children traveling long distance to seek care. There's been an increase in cholera and measles this year due to contaminated water systems. The cholera situation is now under control during the winter, but we will expect a hike starting again once the weather starts to warm up again. Additionally, COVID-19 data is no longer reliable due to lack of a testing system. So we have very unclear ideas of how bad the Omicron situation is. We know anecdotally that people are sick and people are staying home, but we don't know how bad it is because we don't have accurate numbers since there's no more testing facilities in the country. Most concerning for DRC as a protection agency are the additional vulnerabilities for women and children and the negative coping strategies that they're adapting. Afghanistan has always been a very challenging country with regards to gender-based violence and sexual exploitation and abuse. That situation became increasingly worse with the start of COVID when people were really confined to their homes. We knew that the rates of gender-based violence would increase, which they did. And we're hearing reports and gathering evidence that GBV and sexual exploitation and abuse is really rising since August. Early marriage and human trafficking is particularly worrying. We know that there's been a 15% increase in early marriage for young girls since August. The challenge here is that prior to August, there would be an arrangement where young girls would be sold by their parents to men for a set amount of money. And that amount of money would require the men to save up for 2 to 3 to 4 years in order to pay that amount, which gave the young girl more time to age and grow. But now, because of the economic needs in the country, the rate at which young girls are being sold is much lower, which means that they can be married much younger and much faster. So we have increased evidence that girls as young as 9, 10, or 11 are being married off in order to be sold to provide for their household needs. Legal services has dramatically reduced due to the change in the judicial system that's now being managed by the Taliban. We're not able to offer reliable legal services because we're unclear on certain legal statuses in the country, particularly with people's rights to land and home ownership. Child protection is really challenging. We know that there are many children not able to attend schools. And even if they could attend a school, the parents are keeping them at home in order to work, in order to generate money. And we also know that drug use has increased very significantly in a lot of communities, particularly for adult men who are using it as a negative coping strategy due to the trauma of the situation here in the country. And with increased drug use, we see an increased correlation to gender-based violence and sexual exploitation and abuse. There's been a strong hike in internal displacement. Since August, we've seen 700,000 new internally displaced people, and we're also seeing up to 20,000 people return per day from neighboring countries like Iran and Pakistan because they're not able to find work in those countries and are being forcibly sent back into Afghanistan. As a result, there's been a 30% reduction in gross domestic product. There's reduced aid flows. 40% of Afghanistan's GDP prior to August was humanitarian aid and assistance through various channels. That has been severely disrupted. The government is no longer directly receiving humanitarian aid or development funding. So that has a huge consequence about how they pay government salaried staff, teachers, healthcare workers, other essential people that keep the infrastructure of a country running. And I think it's important to note that there's massive numbers of government workers that have not been paid due to these restrictions, but 99% of those people are government workers that were in those roles for many, many years prior to the Taliban takeover in August. So we're impacting people's livelihoods who had no involvement in the takeover, and it's very, very challenging to get their salaries paid. There's incredible border disruptions. Sometimes there are intermittent closures of the border countries, impacting markets and energy and increasing food, fuel, and fertilizer prices. Pakistan closed their border recently. Uzbekistan closed their border for 2 months after their presidential election in December. It's very unclear who's able to get out and get in and why, and who's being forcibly returned and why. There's been an incredibly sudden urban unemployment rate that has spiked very significantly. And the normal displacement patterns that we used to see in Afghanistan that were a result of certain conflicts or seasonal trends that agencies were able to predict are no longer reliable. It's very hard to track who's displacing themselves where and who's going where for what reason. So we've had to change how we've tracked people being displaced and why. As a result of all of this, the United Nations in certain conflict countries releases an annual humanitarian response plan. The humanitarian response plan for Afghanistan in 2022 is $4.5 billion US, which is the single largest UN appeal in their history. And I think that just highlights the incredible amount of needs. The operating environment as a result for agencies like Afghanistan, like DRC in Afghanistan, has been disrupted. Security incidents have decreased significantly since August because the Taliban is now in control of every province. That does provide us a degree of an opportunity. It does allow agencies to get into communities that we weren't able to access before due to high rates of conflict or just the physical access barriers that did not allow us to go there. So we are reaching certain communities and villages for the first time, and we are going to certain communities that have not received humanitarian access or aid in almost a decade. Road access and the ability to hard-to-reach districts has improved as a result. There have been some very challenging elements to female staff participation. In the early months after August, the Taliban tried to take a very hardline stance about not allowing women to work. And NGOs such as DRC said we will not resume our operations or our humanitarian responses if our female staff were not given permission to go back to work. That was able to convince the Taliban, and we do have all of our women working in our offices and in the field. However, there are some additional requirements around that. So women are often required by local provincial governments to be accompanied by a mahram, which means an adult male family chaperone. So that is very challenging for some of our female staff to find an available male chaperone in their family who can accompany them every day to the field in order to do work. We as an agency are trying to push back heavily in the provinces where this is required. We've had some success in some places and we're not successful in others, and we're having to go through this requirement, which is making it very challenging. There has been some improvement in bureaucratic access impediments. I think it's a reality that we need to acknowledge that the previous Afghan government made certain bureaucratic issues very challenging for NGOs. They would often delay our paperwork. They would often delay approvals for our activities. That has actually gone faster now. I think the Taliban does understand that the only way that the population here can get humanitarian aid is through NGOs, so they are providing a degree of faster facilitation around that. And I think another thing that we need to be very mindful of is the potential threat of ISIS. They are gathering certain new recruits, and we are being very conscious of the fact that they may try and increase their incidence around the country, particularly starting after this winter. The other major challenge is the cash liquidity issue. International banks are not sending money here, so NGOs are reliant on local hawalas and financial service providers. And there's a lack of clarity from donors around whether or not we're allowed to pay taxation to the de facto authorities or sign MOUs with them. Some donors and governments say, yes, we can do this. Some say no. So it's very unclear for us. And there's a lack of coordination around our use of local money providers, which is driving their transaction rates up for us. There's also a risk that we're developing these alternate banking models that are disrupting the current banks, which raises a risk of bank panic because people are seeing that the banks here are not running normally. And so we've heard rumors that certain banks will close if there isn't a normal cash flow that returns into the country within the next few months. And then looking forward, we do need a political solution on the central banking cash flow. We do need clarity on exemptions to sanctions for humanitarian aid. We need to mitigate the risk of ISIS in the country. We need to emphasize the importance of open borders for evacuations and migrations, including to Europe. Pakistan and Iran are not ideal places to stay long term. If people, particularly women and children, have very clear reasons why they may need to migrate to safer countries, particularly in Europe, we need to encourage and advocate for European countries to have easier access for those vulnerable people to seek asylum there. We need to have a greater focus on durable solutions, on recovery and resilience. It can't all just be on emergency aid. Yes, there are extreme needs here, but we're not going to be able to tackle the longer term issues, particularly for women and children, if we don't have longer term models that allow us to provide greater support. And we really need to continue the emphasis on principled humanitarian action, which means that we need to make sure that our female staff at NGOs are able to operate in the country safely and without as many impediments as possible. And I think it's also really important that we continue to advocate for the use of multi-purpose cash assistance as part of the humanitarian response. A lot of the interventions that are currently in place do not allow for certain women and children to access those services, but handing out cash to a household really enables them to
usually there's a power cut in Kabul. I think he got a power cut. I think the presentation was quite provocative and also very detailed about the humanitarian situation. And I'm sure there are some points that might have provoked our speakers to react. So until he comes back to ask him those questions that we might have, I'd like to ask Heela-Jan. Afghanistan, as I mentioned earlier, that Afghanistan has been in war for the last 43 years. And why we are in this situation, what went wrong, especially when the peace negotiations started in the last decade, but officially the agreement was made in 2020. So why we are in this situation. Can you give us a political perspective?
Thank you so much. What I'm going to do is perhaps take from what exactly our colleague at DRC was mentioning, that the situation is extremely sad and difficult in Afghanistan. Afghanistan has been a poor country. It's been a country that is geopolitically strategic in the region, but also globally. However, the underlying issues such as poverty, employment, gender equality, were challenges that we've been facing for decades, especially since the start of the Civil War. What happened with the peace process is lessons learned as a student of conflict transformation, but also for the countries that were involved in Afghan politics, especially in the past 20 years. The fall of the Afghan government in August 2021 was basically a radical extremist group taking over with the power of a gun and bleeding the Afghan government over the 3-4 years of the peace process. The peace process usually has certain elements that need to establish its basis and make it credible for the people. Unfortunately, throughout the 3 years of the process, it was never people-centric. One of the fundamental challenges of the peace process was the fact that the United States had decided to withdraw their troops. And that was the main focus of the peace process and the Doha Agreement, not really the durable political solution that the Afghans were looking for in order to find peace. So what happened was that with the 4-point agenda of Mr. Khalilzad, for example, terms such as ceasefire became reduction in violence. It was vague. It meant that violence could continue. That meant that suicide bombers can explode themselves in the heart of Kabul and other cities, as long as the Taliban are talking with the Americans sitting out in Qatar. And this continued, unfortunately, till August of 2021, where they enter the capital with a gunpoint. Of course, the government officials do eventually leave, but the army was there. The army was asked to hand over itself to those Taliban figures who came and took the country with the power of the gun. The army was dissolved, on whose order is very interesting to debate politically. Its logistical ammunitions were sent to the neighboring countries. The challenges that our colleague in DRC was mentioning in terms of food insecurity or poverty were issues that the Republic of Afghanistan was facing anyhow, but now we were faced in a situation where there was lack of or vacuum of power, the United States and its allies were defeated, according to the Haqqanis, who said that the jihad has won once again. So the narrative of jihad won, certainly. And they declared an amnesty for those who had worked with the previous Afghan government. However, the amnesty does not mean anything, because those people who worked in the army or in the armed forces of Afghanistan, or pilots, those individuals who are against the Taliban ideology, women who stand for their rights, or tortured, taken hostage, put in detentions, killed, and anybody that challenges the view of the Islam the current Taliban regime has gets isolated, tortured, or killed. Women are reduced to beggars, which is acceptable, but they're not allowed to get access to education, be a part of the workforce, or move without a mahram. So what exactly happened as lessons learned in the past 40 years of the Afghan conflict is that those countries who are involved in Afghan politics need to stop regime change and promoting one group versus the other. Examples from the Cold War and war on terror show that this isolationism. For example, at the Bonn conference, not all political groups were asked to participate and be present. And that includes the Taliban and the leftists in Afghanistan. The issue of religion and ethnic card, which was used in the civil war, was promoted further with the individuals who were brought on board in the Bonn conference. This continued. And with the constitution, the divisions were further put in print. Promotion of war instead of peace continued, in the sense that funding was given for weapons, funding was given for fighting. However, when the Afghan army was being established, it never ever got its budget directly from the Afghan parliament, but instead the Americans. Issues such as DDR, disarmament, was a subject that the UN was promoting between 2003 to 2005. However, it did not succeed. Why it did not succeed? Something to be learned about. Because the warlords continued to keep their arms under their houses. And it was, the international community knew about this and they turned a blind eye. Transitional justice. There are reports of human rights violation from the Cold War era up until the Civil War, which I'm sure Horia John can tell you more about. However, in 2007, President Karzai declared an amnesty and did not want to publish anything that has to do with violation of human rights or bring about transitional justice. The Doha Agreement actually went, as it was going on, the process, and when it brought about the agreement, it was not about democracy, a value that was pretty much highlighted in the past 20 years. Rather, it was replacement of one group by the other in withdrawal. The focus was never about durable political solution, and the notion of jihad as a not jihad that the Afghans believe, which means the inner struggle for the jihad al-nafs, but this is the violent extremist jihad that was promoted in the Cold War, continued and still continues in Afghanistan. So what's the way forward? There needs to be the way, or finding peace is a question that policymakers, decision makers in the international community, Europe, need to ask themselves whether they want Afghanistan, they want to use Afghanistan for peacemaking or for war making against the rivalries in the world. I mean, I don't have to say anything about what's going on in Ukraine. So, if the objective is to have peace in Afghanistan, there needs to be simultaneous and parallel processes put in place at national level and at international and regional level. Loya Jirga, where you can define as to what this Loya Jirga aims to do, can be truly representative body of people of Afghanistan. That's what the traditional role of the Loya Jirga is, not individuals to be selected or older groups that have proven themselves to be destructive for Afghanistan to be present. There needs to be a consultative process or decision-making body created to be able to bring about political decisions that will eventually lead to an election. And by those political decisions, I mean that you need to have active political parties on the ground from all walks of life, left to right. The role of the political parties could be defined, and all of them could be registered. What will we do in terms of disarmament in Afghanistan could be truly sought, and one could learn from the mistakes of the past. What should be the role of those who have fought in Afghanistan from all sides? What should be the future army of Afghanistan like could be questioned. The Loya Jirga could have a representative national political system for 24 months or so that could lead to an election. And all of this could happen if we could internationally at the UN seek neutrality and truly establish a representative political structure inside the country. My hope as an Afghan who has researched in this field and someone who wishes truly, and now I'm being a bit maybe emotional to see peace in my country, is that countries like Austria, who are neutral, do understand the needs for countries like ours to be able, and our people who've suffered for 40 years, to truly find ourselves and allow us to be able to find our solutions by enabling to bring about this mechanism. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Heela John, for your comprehensive presentation about the causes of Afghanistan war and also the solutions that you have presented. Before I come to Horia John, I just want to ask one question. Since the Taliban, you mentioned that the Taliban have taken power with gun. Do you see any actual resistance and political opposition to the Taliban at this point? That's one question. Maybe you can be brief on that, and also on the neutrality, which is very important aspect of your solutions. How that neutrality can be ensured to achieve a durable political solution. Yes, please.
Okay. So, about an alternative to the Taliban. You see, what's really interesting is that when I would talk to the Afghans who worked in the government, or I would talk to some people from the United States, and I would ask them, in the 20 years that you were in Afghanistan, why didn't you establish an opportunity to create political functioning system? The answer I get from a foreigner is that our strategy perhaps was not really political, it was military. And therefore, we couldn't establish a successful political structure. Yet, I know of groups in Afghanistan who tell me that perhaps President Karzai didn't want a political party, or President Ghani didn't want a political party. And my answer to an alternative is that there are Afghans who are educated, not only in the past 20 years, but before that as well. There are these Afghans who are not corrupt. They worked in the government, they worked in the ministries, they worked in the provinces. There are people in the civil society who are educated. And these are the real alternative to the Taliban. Politically, however, when I talk about a consultative process of a coalition, I mean that all these groups can come together and find a way and discuss how they could work together to be able to establish this consultative process. So yes, the Taliban could be one, NRF could be another one, the Hizbis could be the third party. How do they come together and work together to be able to establish a neutral Afghanistan? The reason I mention neutrality is because if you look at the history of Afghanistan, the periods, historically, the periods that were in peace and you didn't have war was when Afghanistan was neutral or adopted the neutrality path. Whether it was during Amir Abdurrahman Khan or Habibullah Khan or Nader Khan or Zahir Shah, right? So, and that is because we were always geopolitically in between different superpowers. In the 19th century, we were between Tsarist Russia and British India. Then it was during the Cold War, during Zahir Shah, we were between United States and Soviet Union. And then post the collapse of Soviet Union, it was regional rivalries that brought all the wars and made things worse in Afghanistan. So if we really want to have a peaceful future, is that those who are involved and right now are waiting like eagles to see when the opportunity is so they could jump in, is for them to say, yes, we could have a neutral way, provided that internally we have this consultative process established. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your answer. I'm sure the audience will have some questions to your remarks, and I make sure that to accommodate all those questions. And now to you, Horia Jan. You've been very, very active in the area of human rights and women's rights. Please tell me, how do you assess, how do you evaluate the human rights situation and women's rights situation in particular under the Taliban and since August 15? The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to ask will you ask other follow-up questions, or I just go in the lengths?
It depends what you say.
Okay, so, thank you. Thank you. دوستای عزیز بسیار زیاد خوش آمدین. عصر همگی شما بخیر. And I welcome all the friends who are here, and as Dr. Saib said, I'm quite excited to see such a big crowd who are taking interest into the situation of Afghanistan. I don't know what can I really add after listening to what Mr. Jared from the DRC and Heela John mentioned. Yeah, the situation is quite depressing. When we started fighting for a better Afghanistan, this was the least to expect that would happen after 20 years. I think the most depressing part is that I never imagined that my children will be the second generation of refugees, and you would flee the second term of the Taliban. And I think this is a better reality for millions of Afghans that we are facing now. And I would also say that it was a collective failure. It was a collective failure by the international community and Afghans, I would say, as well. I'm sure it's a naked secret, I would say, that what have happened to Afghanistan after 15th of August. I think now we are dealing with a regime that is not only a gender apartheid regime, that is not simply recognizing women as human beings. We are dealing with a government that simply does not recognize anyone that is standing against their way of living that you're choosing and imposing on over 35 million of the population. And we are dealing with a government that in no Islamic world we have seen an example of it. I don't think that even 1,400 years ago, when Islam was introduced to the world, have seen anything, any example of that. And we are dealing with a government that is built on violence, built on discrimination, and built on, I think, the worst of all, a government that does not recognize anyone aside from its own followers. In the past 6 months, we not only have seen that all the achievements of the past 20 years have been taken away from us. Like on 14th of August, women were ambassadors, they were ministers, they were members of the parliament, they were journalists, they were leaders, they were entrepreneurs, they were teachers, they were students. On 15th of August, they woke up being no one, with no identity. And also, it doesn't end there. Like Ms. Najibullah spoke about the general amnesty. Since Taliban took over, hundreds of people who simply laid down their weapons, they were part of the Afghan National Security Forces. They laid down their weapons. They were not actively fighting against the Taliban. They simply surrendered. They were taken, they were tortured, they were killed, they were disappeared. And we have hundreds of cases of extrajudicial killings, enforced disappearances, torture, and arbitrary detention of hundreds of people. Their only crime was that they were part of the former government. it doesn't end here, unfortunately. We have also seen that how our fundamental and basic civil liberties have taken away from us. Women were disappeared, they were tortured, they were beaten up, and they were kept in detention centers simply because they were peacefully protesting and asking for their rights to access education, access employment. I, as an Afghan, I would say that I feel so much betrayed by everyone at the international community, from the United Nations to the US, to the Europeans, to almost everyone. When we speak about neutrality of the United Nations, are they really neutral? An institution that is I think the fundamental values that the United Nations was created is to create international or global peace. Are they really doing that? No. United Nations has turned into a tool in the hand of a couple of powerful countries. For example, 1 year, United Nations put a list of I don't know how many individuals as international terrorists, and they impose sanctions on them. And the next day you wake up, they are delisted. How bad you can be to make yourself into the United Nations sanction list, and how worse you could become to get delisted. Same, my trust have been also eroded from the International Criminal Court. For the past 20 years, Afghanistan is bleeding. An International Criminal Court even didn't dare to say that they want to investigate crimes, war crimes that are happening in Afghanistan. Despite so much evidence that were there. This was because US was involved in war crimes in Afghanistan, because NATO was involved in war crimes in Afghanistan with the Taliban. But now with Ukraine, suddenly overnight, the International Criminal Court is announcing that they want an investigation into the situation of Ukraine. This is because the crimes are committed by the people that they don't like. The world has turned into a concept of good human rights abusers and bad human rights abusers. Good human rights abusers could still commit the most heinous crimes and they can get away with it. And then bad human rights abusers are that they can commit crimes, but because they are not friends with America, with EU, with NATO, then they can really get branded with all sorts of things. So this is where we are after 6 months, that a red carpet is being extended for a group that is known for their human rights abuses. A party or a group that is being on the United Nations terrorist sanction list. And where we are now, like Taliban have taken hostage of over 35 million Afghans. When we speak about the concentration camps in the World War II, in 21st century, Afghanistan has turned into a concentration camp by the Taliban. 35 million of people are being starved, and they are blackmailing the international community that if you do not recognize us, we will not allow you to feed these people. Is this really acceptable? Imagine if this happens in Europe. I'm glad that European Parliament, European Commission, and other members of the EU, as well as NATO, US, United Nations, everyone came together to condemn Russia for its aggression on Afghanistan. And it didn't take them even days to do that. They were so quick to jump and put the harshest possible sanctions on Russia. I'm glad they did that. And this should happen to every aggressor, not just to Russia. It should happen to Pakistan, that is invading Afghanistan for the past 40 years, and they turned our country into a living graveyard by supporting every terrorist group to fight inside our soil and kill our children. But because Pakistan is an ally of the US, an ally of the EU, nothing is happening against it. Over a dozen sanctioned terrorist groups are freely operating inside Pakistan. And still there is no action against it. When we speak of neutrality, does neutrality really exist? And what price we have paid for being a neutral, Ms. Najibullah? At least in my life, in the past 40 years, I'm seeing that we are paying a heavy price for being neutral. And no one considers us as neutral. Have we been neutral? Exactly. So for that reason, I really think that, like, if we look at the past 6 months, I think the worst that can happen is how the history repeats itself in Afghanistan, and how the history is being repeated in other war and conflict situations around the world, and how the world can, one day they call a group terrorist, the next day they are sharing a bed and sleeping with them in the same room. One day they are enemy and the other day they are allies. When the world is not consistent, what do we expect? Of course, it also gives a green light to countries like Russia and the right to invade another country like Ukraine. Because they know that there is no consequences for the aggressors, there is no consequences for the human rights violations, and there is no consequences for whatever action they want to take, because the power speaks, not the humanity.
Thank you for this. Thank you, Horia, for this powerful remarks. When you said the good human rights abusers and the bad human rights abusers, it reminds me of the narrative in the Afghan media and also some international media of good Taliban and bad Taliban. The good Taliban kill less people and bad Taliban kill more people. And I feel the sense of betrayal, or what you said by EU and US. I listened to your, you were at the European Parliament last month, early February, and you raised 2 questions and asked the members of the European Parliament. And one question was about the EU countries actually are inviting the Taliban to Oslo, to Geneva, and maybe to other European countries without being, interrogated who they are and their background. And the second question you raised, as you mentioned in your speech as well, the Pakistan's aggression towards Afghanistan. So you asked these questions. Did you get an answer from the members of the European Parliament? And if you got an answer, what was your answer to both these questions?
No, unfortunately, I did not get any answer to these questions. And I was also surprised that the next day, some members of the European Parliament came to me and they said, hey, listen, Norway is not part of the EU. Does it make really any difference? But Norway is a European country. Norway is a member of the European Economic Area. Norway is a member of the European Commonwealth. So is this really an excuse? And then, of course, when Taliban went to Geneva, it will be the same thing. Yeah, because Geneva is not, or Switzerland is not a member of the EU. That's it, yeah, I think that was the answer I got.
An answer on Pakistan's aggression? Did you get an answer?
Well, they don't have any policy against or towards Pakistan at all. Pakistan is one of their allies, and they are perfectly fine with whatever it does. So, yeah, well done.
Thank you so much. I just come back to Jared. I think Jared was in his last slide. Before I ask him just one very quick question. Please be prepared and prepare your questions. You can ask your questions in English or German, and also to our audience who are watching us live, you can send your questions through, and we will post them to the speakers. Jared, if you hear me, maybe how because of the banking system in Afghanistan since August. How do you get money, DRC, and do you face shortages of money? If you can elaborate on that, thank you.
Yes, thank you, and sorry that I cut out. There was a brief power outage here in Kabul. So we, DRC, like all of the other large NGOs and other civil society organizations, and previously the UN, we're relying on these local Hawala agents to provide infusions of cash for us. And we, because we're a larger agency, have to use more than one Hawala so that they can meet our cash-based needs. The Hawalas are basically local money lenders that have cash reserves available to them in order to distribute cash in local markets. So the vendors that we use are able to meet DRC's demands. We're able to pay our staff each month on time. We're able to deliver all of our activity commitments on time. The challenge is that there are such great humanitarian needs here in the country that we could be doing more, and we could be getting more donor funds in order to expand our work. But we cannot commit to an extremely large increase of our portfolio because we're not able to guarantee that the Hawalas can meet our increased demands. So we have to moderate what we can commit to based on the limited cash availability in the country. So where we're at now, yes, we can meet what we need, but if we were to go significantly higher, then we would run into problems. But the needs are higher, so we're not able to meet all of the demands of the local people as a result of that, which is a shame.
Thank you. Is there any, do you want to, any quick reaction to Jared's remarks?
I had 11 DRC became operational from what he was saying. I just want to know what were the factors that they chose which provinces to operate from.
So DRC is very much an agency that focuses on displacement. So the initial scope of our provinces were the areas that received a large number of internally displaced persons, where there were IDP camps, where we were seeing a large number of returnees from other countries come and settle temporarily before going back to their own provinces of origin. So we initially set up operations in Kabul, Kandahar, Herat, Jalalabad, and Mazar, because those are where there are large numbers of IDP populations or returnee populations. And we've expanded our provinces based on those initial hubs where we operate. So we also are very needs focused, and if there are new provinces where we don't work, where we see a real need and a gap in the agencies providing support, then we will go there as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. So now it's time for the audience to raise some questions. We have some questions online that have received. Mike, who has the mic? And I ask the audience, please prepare your questions. Okay. Yes, I see you.
I have some questions from Facebook. The first one goes to Jared. It's from Faisal Rahman, who is the chairman of the Afghan Mullahs, who is fortunately not able to join us today here because he is infected by the coronavirus. So his question is the Taliban creating obstacles to your daily work and operations? And how is the Taliban treating you, Jared, and DRC members? This is the first question. And the second one goes to Heela Najibullah. It's from Syed Siruyuddin Khalid. What do you think would be the implication of the rise and the re-emergence of the Taliban in Afghanistan for the region and globally security, particularly taking into consideration their close ties with Al-Qaeda and other regional and transnational terror groups?
Thank you. We go with Jared.
So I think that DRC for a number of years now has been working on a number of access initiatives that would help us establish certain relationships with the Taliban in order to gain access to their communities in a very principled way. So we were an actor that has been known to them for a number of years. So when they took over control in August, DRC was an NGO that they were familiar with. And so we have not run into an incredibly large number of problems. And they have been fairly quick to provide approvals and access for our new projects and our ability to work. I think we're very fortunate in that way, and that is definitely not the case for other NGOs, particularly women's-led local civil society organizations have faced an extreme amount of problems, and they're very much struggling. And we're trying our best to support local civil society in the country. I think, in terms of the treatment of our staff and our ability to work, they are presenting certain obstacles that make things challenging logistically, but not impossible. I would say that the Ghani administration was hostile to NGOs in a number of ways and made things very challenging for us. And the Taliban is actually adopting similar models of interference at a local level that we're trying to manage and resolve. But I think in a bigger picture sense, they understand that NGOs are needed in the country and that we're the primary providers of humanitarian aid at the moment, because certainly money is not flowing to the government to do that work. So it's a complicated scenario, but DRC has been able to navigate those dynamics in the country, I would say, fairly effectively. And as a result, we're trying to help others who are struggling more.
Thank you, Jared. And Lejan?
Yes. Last month, the United Nations report about stating the fact that the relationship of the Taliban with the terrorist groups such as Al-Qaeda remains so. The fact of the matter that Pakistan is going to the Haqqanis to be able to strike a deal with TTP in Pakistan, a peace deal, itself shows the kind of relationship the terrorist groups and these terror organizations have had with each other, and the fact also that Islamic movements and terror groups in Northern Africa and Nigeria are emboldened by this narrative of jihad is something that the Western world and the peaceful society, globally needs to be aware of. It's certainly a threat, but also what is extremely important to note here that the Taliban are not one unified group. These are divided groups with different interests, in Afghanistan. Since the takeover, they're establishing madrasas, especially Haqqani madrasas, where the army that they're trying to come up with, they have a special unit for suicide bombers. These are all alarms, for a peaceful society that needs to be considered, because they do have their relationship with these terror groups, and they continue the narrative of jihad and embolden all those groups that are active around the world.
Thank you for the answer. Now I take a few questions from the audience. I see Hem actually as, and then I'll come back to the other side. I'll take questions from this side, and then the second round I'll take for the question here.
I have a question. I don't know who wants to answer, but you told us Afghanistan needs cash urgent. There are $10 billion of the National Bank of Afghanistan in US. What do you think about the plan of President Biden to spend the half of this cash to American victims of 9/11?
Very good question. Yes, you, sir. Here, there, in the back. Yeah.
Well, good evening. So, my question is, my parents are from Afghanistan, and I was born in India. So, I've been asking my parents about the situation of war times and all the stuff. I've read dozens of books. I'm also writing a pre-scientific work on the Soviet invasion in Afghanistan. So since 1973, when President Muhammad Dawood forced his uncle to abolish the monarchy and took power, since then there have been this power vacuum in Afghanistan. 5 years later, the communists took power, and then the Soviets come. So if King Zahir Shah had continued to reign further, do you think Afghanistan would be in the same situation as it is now?
Thank you. Counterfactual analysis. This question needs history. Thank you. Yes, here we take 4 or 5 questions, and yeah, yes, please.
Hello, you're welcome to Vienna, both of you. It's a very important moment that right now the protests in Kabul, women protests are being suppressed by the Taliban, and we have these 2 Afghan women speaking about Afghan women rights, and it's really important to hear from Afghan women. In 2001, when America was invading Afghanistan, the slogans were fighting for human rights, killing Osama bin Laden, but the main reasons were bringing a democracy and everything like that. And after 2 decades of killings and massacre, and hundreds of thousands of people were killed, and Biden said that Afghanistan was not a unified country in their history, not a nation, and that Afghanistan, we were not there for democracy or nation building, we were not there for human rights, and we have managed our case, and they killed Osama bin Laden, which was also not in Afghanistan, but in Pakistan. What do you think of this victim blaming, of that you destroy a country and then blame the victims there? And the second question would be that this romance between Taliban and the USA. So do you think, like, it also existed, America had their relations with the terrorists in the Cold War, and again right now they are having their relations. Will this be will this stay this way, or will they again feel the need to invade another time Afghanistan in some other attacks or some other problems? Will it remain like this? Thank you.
Thank you. I humbly ask you to be brief in your questions, because we have this event of so much time, and I want to include as many participants as possible. Yes, this lady, please.
Thank you so much. I would have, we've heard a lot of criticism, and we've also heard some recommendations already when it comes to engagement with Pakistan, but also like a process internally. I would like to follow up concretely on the recommendations that you put out. On the one hand, what should the international community do? And I would be particularly interested when it comes to engagement with the Taliban or non-engagement with the Taliban. And on the other hand, sort of the Afghan society, you mentioned this, what is sort of a pluralistic system, an inclusive system. It seems we're so far, or sort of the situation in the country is far away from that with all the fragmentation. So how to get there really, or sort of what to do in this regard? Thank you.
Thank you. We take one last question here, and then the next round I'll come back to this side. Please.
Thank you very much to the speakers. My question is referring to the last presentation by Ms. Najibullah before the questions started. It is referring to the alternative to the Taliban, and to remind, she was mentioning there are persons in the country who she considers educated, experienced, and with a mindset that could present an alternative. And my question is, what holds the people back, or what is needed to get this alternative in place? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we like to answer maybe the first question on the $10 billion reserve. Who want to?
Thank you. I think, is it working? Yeah. Yeah, I can't hear myself. Yeah. Thank you. In regard to the $10 billion, honestly, I was shocked at the naivety of the US president and naivety of their lawyers who are supposedly like, they know the law. And I was absolutely surprised that they are putting the bill to the hands of the victims rather than perpetrators. You know, because first, we all know that none of the attackers were Afghan. Second, Osama bin Laden is a Saudi citizen. He's a billionaire. He has billions of dollars of his money in the Saudi. Why US didn't ask Saudi Arabia to pay for the compensation of the victims to ask Afghans to pay? Second, Osama bin Laden was harbored and protected by the Pakistani army. Why these lawyers did not ask Pakistan to top up a little bit of the bill for the victims of the 9/11? Honestly, I think this, I couldn't be more shocked to see that not only the president, but even someone who is educated to know the law could be that naive.
Thank you. Of course, you can pick up the other questions, and if you wanted to add on the 10 billion US question.
Well, there were, you see, President Biden had already given indication during his election time when, in his speeches, he said, you know, I have zero responsibility when it comes to literally doing this towards Afghanistan. And for all he cares, he rather put his bases in Pakistan than deal with Afghanistan. And that's exactly the rhetoric which he acted upon. Whether the money is of the Afghan nation or not, he's already declared he doesn't have zero responsibility. Whether that makes it correct is the question for international community, and for us Afghans, that's absolutely non-acceptable in the civilized world we are in today. Now, coming to the issue of engagement with the Taliban. In the West, where you value democracy, where you value human rights, where you value freedom of speech, women's rights, education, access to healthcare, I mean, basic fundamental rights of any individual. Engagement with the Taliban means is that you undermine exactly those values and accept the narrative that they have won the war and their jihad has succeeded. So you're already engaging with the Taliban. If you're meeting them in Oslo, right? Or if you're meeting them in Geneva, you are engaging with them. You're not recognizing them. So the point I'm making is that the West needs to ask itself, face themselves in the mirror and say, you know, do we really want to uphold these values? In which case, you know, we need to determine what the next future steps of our policy should be towards Afghanistan. That's one. The other thing, what Jared was saying and what, you know, you're talking about the 10 billion being taken by the Americans or frozen. Why is it that the Western society always takes the decisions to make a society dependent on them? You did establish a structure and an institution. Like the institutions were set up in Afghanistan. You brought it up in such a way where it started falling apart with the peace process. And now, again, you funded trillions of dollars. Of course, this doesn't mean that Afghans are not responsible for the things that went wrong. But once again, Afghanistan is absolutely economically dependent on the West, and we're going ahead engaging with the same people that caused this war, caused you to pay $1 trillion, caused your soldiers to give their lives, right? And say that there is no other alternative. If you really wanted an alternative, you would not try to make ethnicity, religion, and different groups to fight against each other, which this happened with the policies that were implemented throughout the 20 years. This continued. So when you do choose to engage after looking at yourself in the mirror, please also know that if any society, if in Austria tomorrow, because we're talking about power, if there were powerful countries that talked about Tyroleans being against Viennese, or, for example, the kind of problems you have along religion, Catholic versus Protestant and evangelicals and all, and bring up the issue of race, you know, I don't know how you'd be able to keep calm and peace. And we Afghans have been resisting this despite all the interferences regionally and internationally for the past 40 years, and we still get up and restart our lives and say, give us a chance. So what I'm saying here, that before you do recognize the Taliban, you need to give the Afghans a chance here, so they can decide their own future, which you have not done for the past 40 years. And this is exactly what the gentleman, the young man, was saying there. It did start from Daoud Khan's time, because that balance of neutrality that was somewhat determined by the monarchy it became imbalanced, or it lost its entity, and the rivalry of the Cold War took over. But then I often, in any society, when one system gets to stay without people's choices, you'll always have individuals to stand up against it. So what caused the communists to get up, or the jihadis to get up against Zahir Shah? Why was it in 1959 that when they wanted a constitutional monarchy, the parties were not allowed to function? And now the Taliban, look how intelligent, right? They're saying, we're going to Zahir Shah's constitution. Why? Because there is no political parties there. There's an absolute power, right? That's what they want. And that's not what the people of Afghanistan want after 20 years of freedom. And then finally, on all the alternative, I am amazed that with 49 countries as allies of the United States, being in Afghanistan for 20 years, you're not in touch with Afghans, you're not in touch with diplomats, you're not in touch with technocrats, civil society individuals who are not corrupt, who stand for a united Afghanistan, the women who stand up and say we don't want the Taliban, groups of diaspora who had to leave everything that stand up. And we cannot choose individuals to come and represent their country. Bring artists, bring politicians, bring diplomats, technocrats, and let the society be represented, and ask them, how would you like your future government to look like? How do you want to go ahead with peace? And not do the mistake of 2002 when you brought the warlords after the Bonn conference, where all the women were wondering what to do, because these were the reasons that we had to escape. They raped, they killed, they maimed people, and now we have to just accept them because the United States and its allies want this. I think that's the lesson that needs to be learned. Bring the true Afghans here who would stand for peace and would find a way, if you allow them, to create a solution for themselves. Thank you.
Thank you. Jared, is there anything you want to add?
Yes, just very quickly on to the last point that was just raised and the question about the alternatives. And I very much agree that there is a strong, educated population of people that have a lot of potential here. I think the challenge now is that those middle-class people are the ones leaving the country, and the ones that were the first group of people to leave in August. The scenes at the airport of everyone getting on the planes were largely people that were middle class and had the financial resources to leave and establish lives in other places. And I think that, if we want to invest in them, and if they are the future, and if they are the alternative, we need to ensure that there's an environment that allows them and enables them to stay. So a start would be to make sure that they're getting their paychecks, because these people have been working in their positions, particularly civil society or government workers, for several months now without a steady income. The other thing is that we need to make sure that they will have certain resources and protection if they're to stand up and play an opposing voice. That they know that if they were to play a role in, having a counter argument to the values of what the Taliban is promoting, that they won't face persecution or violence. And I do think international pressure around that would be helpful. Making sure that we as an international community to say that there needs to be freedom of speech to a large degree in this country, will then help further that alternative that we hope to see help balance the dynamics in the country. We have to rely on different voices. I think that the women's local civil society leaders that have been protesting in Kabul and in other large cities have done enormously brave work, and they're very, very exposed, and we need to provide them with a degree of protection. So that's it on my side.
Thank you. Thank you. Now I'd like to take some questions from that lady just in the last seat. She's been raising her hand. Yes, please.
Thank you. So thanks for giving me the opportunity. I just wanted to, so I have two questions. One question is more technical. So on actually last Friday, the United States issued a new general license, and this general license kind of sounds like a lifting of sanctions on Afghanistan. So basically, these licenses are how the United States Treasury Department is managing their sanctions, and they've issued an exemption for the Afghan state on, so basically saying that, okay, yeah, you can do transactions with the Afghan state, although it is controlled by the Taliban. So I would like to know whether like what's DRC is thinking, whether they believe that this is really going to affect them and whether this will be a basis for the banking system to restart. So, and then another issue that's more directed towards towards the two of you, Ms. Horia Mosadiq, for instance. So you're speaking out against engagement with the Taliban, but at the same time, you do know that there is this massive humanitarian crisis, that people are starving. You have hundreds of people actually dying each day due to hunger. That's the official UN figures that are being put out there. In this moment, the only way to deliver any services, to do anything for the people inside Afghanistan, who should be the people we care about most, is via engagement with the de facto authorities. And you've heard also from the representative of the Danish Refugee Council that actually humanitarian aid and aid work is being permitted, that this is going forward as soon as money is being put into the country. Now, as long as you are speaking out against engagement with the Taliban, what do you expect to happen from this? It's just going to exacerbate a very grave humanitarian disaster, and the people in Afghanistan are starving because in 20 years, the Afghan elites and the international community have completely failed in establishing a functioning system.
Thank you. We got you a question.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Yes, we pick up this question, and then I'll come to you. Please be brief in your question.
Very brief. Hello, everyone. My name is Samim Ahmadi. I'm an Afghan citizen, born and raised in Afghanistan. I was working in migration management until last July. I want to make a very brief remark on what Mr. Jarrett said. I was the head of office for an international, actually a Vienna-based organization, International Center for Migration Policy Development. In my experience, working for 12 years in migration management, it would be a bit unfair if we talked only of the negatives of the previous government. I believe there was a group of young Afghan men and women, highly educated, who were trying to establish some sort of governance mechanism when it came to the areas of migration management. And that is why there were systems and governance and mechanisms that made the channel some sort of bureaucratic. Now, if you compare it to the current situation in Afghanistan, and not romanticizing the Taliban as humanitarian aid or angels, none of that exists, and neither the capacity to have the mechanism and governance. It doesn't exist either. So, and that is why you also have access across the country. And if you remember why you didn't have access, it was because of the Taliban. At some point, we were living and compounds in Afghanistan where we couldn't move or coordinate. That was another issue. This is just a remark that I wanted to.
Thank you.
I wanted to share.
Thank you so much. And Ger.
My name is Mechthild Geier, and I will do my very best to keep my remarks brief. Many thanks, first of all, to all the speakers of the panel for these exciting insights. Now my question goes to Heela Najibullah. Heela, you suggested to achieve peace, we should gather some kind of consultative body where people discuss and reach some, I imagine, power equilibrium, which will finally lead to democratic elections. And I imagine to that consultative body also the Taliban or some armed groups should belong. Now, my question is, and if I may make that comparison, especially in the face of the brutality of the Kremlin currently in the Ukraine, my question is, how shall we convince those who have learned that they can overrun every democratic entity just with their cruelty? How shall we convince them to join such a consultative body? Thank you.
Thank you. We just take one more question from from this side, and if we have, okay.
Hello, everybody. We all do know now that the Taliban is having the power right now in Afghanistan, and I'm not happy to see them to be the ones in the government, but at the same time I wonder how can we prevent a starving in Afghanistan without dealing with the Taliban. And my second question is, how can we stop them or doing something effectively against them? Thank you.
Yeah, I'll take one last question, and then and that lady there was, yes, because then we have to wrap up.
Hello, I'm Wagma from Afghan Woolers Cultural Association. My question goes to Ms. Heela Najibullah. As your colleagues said, that the past has repeated itself. My question is, do you see any similarities or contraindications to the last president, Dr. Ashraf Ghani, and the last president before the Mujahideen and the Taliban came, Dr. Najibullah, in terms of propaganda campaigns and weakening the governments due to or because of Pakistan and the US and other countries? Do you see any similarities in this? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Maybe the first question I'll ask Jared, because there was the first question on lifting the sanctions and the effect of that on your work. Maybe you can be brief on that.
Sure. The general licenses have started being issued since late September by the US government. And yes, they do provide a degree of flexibility for humanitarian aid actors to do their work. There are two challenges. One is that the international banks are very risk averse. And even though the general licenses are allowing them to send money in order for us to provide this aid, they're still too risk averse to try and send the money. That is starting to change. We've seen a few international banks over the last week or two start to make wire transfers, and we're hoping that that will be able to establish more of a precedent. It's very possible that the last general license that was issued, which was very broad, will help with that. The other challenge is that the US is just one government. So we really need to see additional sanctions exemptions being provided by the other large donors to Afghanistan, particularly the EU and the UK. have not provided overwhelmingly clear and broad guidance on sanctions exemptions. Yes, to some degree, but not in a widespread way similar to the U.S. So we need a number of different actors to provide similar guidance in order for us to comprehensively provide that support.
Thank you, Jared. And Horia, the other question was addressed to you.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know how you got the impression that I said people should get starved and we shouldn't get engaged with the Taliban. I did not mention that in my speech, and I don't know how you received that impression. Anyway, let me make it clear that when we speak about engagement of the Taliban, I'm giving you a number of examples which I believe that engagement without conditions and preconditions with the Taliban is extremely dangerous. When Norway invited Taliban to come and meet them in Oslo, soon after that, the confidence of Taliban boosted to the extent that right the next day, they started arresting half a dozen of journalists. They raided a number of safe houses across Afghanistan, and they took those women and men, and they were disappeared for almost several weeks. And those raids happened in Mazar-e-Sharif and in Kabul. Women and children were taken hostage, and no one knew about their whereabouts, and Taliban kept denying that they were not part of that raid, which several weeks later, then the same group came forward and said, yes, now we have released these women that we have taken from several safe houses that we raided. Following to Norway, then Taliban were invited to Geneva. Soon after Taliban went to Geneva, then they started putting another level of, I would say, like restrictions on Afghans, which was like they came forward and they put general travel ban on people. They stopped all the evacuation operations across Afghanistan. And they said that no person can leave Afghanistan without having a reasonable excuse to leave, and only the ones who are able to leave with the passport and visas. And they suspended all the evacuation operations that were happening. Same happened when Taliban were invited to Doha. So we can see like the more leverage, the more unconditional engagement that you are providing to the Taliban, it leads to further separations of Afghans, because they know that they can keep 35 million of Afghans as a hostage and starve them in return for the humanitarian aid. What is the alternative? In 1990s, when Afghanistan was at the middle of the civil war, no one recognized Mujahideen groups or the Taliban as a government. But still, the aid groups were able to operate with the help of the United Nations, international and local aid agencies. So this could be one of the alternatives that can happen. Second, any engagement needs to be conditional. Like we will engage with you at this particular issue, but in return for 30% of the aid workers have to be women. And these women need to be engaged from the need assessment to the planning to the implementation. Afghanistan has been in war for over 40 years. We have millions of widows. How this aid is going to reach to those women if women aid workers are not engaged in that? We had thousands of women who are working on different aspects of Afghanistan. We have so many women that are in need of jobs. If this is not one of the conditions, or for example, one of the conditions could be that, yes, we will engage with you if you just now announce that women can return to their work. Like everyone got so excited when Taliban announced that schools can reopen in March. But what opening a school means if these women have no future after finishing their schools, if there are no opportunities for employment, if they are stopped and they are banned from entering into unemployment. Just 2 days before, Taliban announced that no woman can enter any government agency without being accompanied by a man, by a mahram. So these are the type of conditions that you can put in return for your engagement. But the engagement doesn't mean recognition, and it shouldn't mean recognition.
I think there were a few questions that were addressed to you. Maybe you can, combine them and give just one answer. Thank you.
Absolutely, and it comes to, I absolutely agree with Ria John, and just would add one more thing. The reason for starvation and the horrible humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan is majority of it also goes to the haphazard withdrawal, the failure of the peace process, and the freezing of the assets of the Afghan people and the United States. So, so this is not the fact that we as women are saying, yes, you're already engaging, but you're not addressing the fundamental core issues that needs to be addressed, so we don't have to go through the crisis again and again and come and beg you for money to save us. Because we're sick and tired of going through this. We have enough self-respect not to go through it, right? Now, in terms of the consultative process, who whitewashed Sirajuddin Haqqani during the peace process? How did he get access to New York Times to publish an opinion? I certainly didn't want that. Who made that happen? I don't get access to New York Times to write about women issues, right? When Kabul was taken over, the key positions were taken by the same groups that were promoted, safeguarded, and hosted by Pakistan. These are the groups who are taking the Afghan people who are dying of hunger, closing the borders as hostage so they could be recognized. But this does not mean that certain figures of the Taliban don't want to make peace. They're not all Haqqanis. A lot of the Taliban in the field who joined the forces to fight were exactly the reasons of the abuse of war crimes that went on. It was the same poverty, it was the same kind of discrimination that went on for decades. So you need to be able to separate these things. It's not very, it's extremely complex, and it's not black and white. And when I say I need to have a consultative process, because I don't see any other option. If I am saying so-and-so or this group has a point, I get accused of being of a certain ethnic group, speaking a certain language, belonging to a certain family, to say that. If I say that the other person needs to be included, then I'm again accused of all these things. So, and it's not entirely our fault, because this is exactly the fuel that was burnt in years by the different regional and global players. So, for me, I don't have a choice. If I were to say Russia, United States, China, Pakistan, India, Iran, leave us alone so that different groups do not fight amongst each other, I, as an Afghan, want all of these guys to sit together and the people of Afghanistan to hold them accountable. When was this done in the past 20 years? It started off in 2002 in a biased manner. So I don't have any other choice, but this is the only choice that my logic and tells me at the moment. Or the other option would be ISIS. Oh, wait a minute. What did Khalilzad say? Republic of Afghanistan, the government, and the Taliban come together to fight ISIS. Now, all of a sudden, ISIS has become the main enemy, and we have to all fear it, and nobody knows how did ISIS come about. And that's the trick. So again, are we Afghans supposed to go through another outfit for war and be exploited? So that's the only logic I can come up with. Bring everybody so we can stop this vicious cycle of violence. But maybe I'm too idealistic. Then finally, there was one more question about comparisons. You cannot entirely compare Najibullah's administration with Ghani's. First of all, and I'm not saying this because he's my father, by the way, I'm saying this because in Afghanistan during his time, it was only Soviet Union that was backing him up. In the past 20 years, there were 49 countries. And they still had issues to administer the country. In terms of the peace-building processes, what I would like to say that is similar is the fact that the Soviet Union wanted to withdraw, but it was also affected internally with their politics, and it started collapsing. In the United States, they wanted to withdraw, and they didn't know who else to support, so they brought the Taliban. They haven't collapsed. And now what they're doing is trying to say that Taliban is the only alternative. And that's extremely dangerous. So in terms of losing their backup, there are similarities. In terms of the world orders changing, I wouldn't say that's the same. The rest of the similarities, you and I can talk outside then. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We have really run out of time, but just for the sake of closing this session, I would just ask one question from everyone to give me just one sentence as a closing statement. I know it might be difficult, but maybe to Jared that 23 million Afghan will survive from the starvation, which is in the news. And will Afghan women, in 2022 or in the near future, will they get their rights, their basic rights under the Taliban? And any healing and reconciliation you see in Afghanistan? Jared, please, just one sentence, one very, not very long.
Sure, thank you, and thanks to everyone for this evening. I think that the humanitarian aid community is doing everything in its power to try and make sure that there is not starvation at a massive scale in this country. We need certain conditions in place that allow more money to come in order for us to guarantee that. but it is a very precarious, dangerous time in the country, and we just need to stay vigilant and keep Afghanistan on our international radar. So thank you for hosting an event like this to make sure Afghanistan still remains very much on our minds.
Thank you, Jared. And put it on.
Yeah, well, regardless of whether Taliban give us the right or not, women will always be there. And we will stand, we will fight, we will continue our struggle. It wasn't rosy in the past, but we managed to get so much done in the wake of everything that was happening in Afghanistan, and we will survive, and we will be there.
Thank you. And Heela John, yours.
I just wanted to thank VIDC for shedding light and continuing to talk about Afghanistan while Ukraine war wages. So I thank you all. I think it's extremely important not to forget Afghanistan exactly. And my concluding remarks would be is that for Afghans, we're not victims. Yes, we have internal issues. Yes, we have hurt each other as a family. But if we don't want our children tomorrow to suffer the way we have, we need to be able to hold each other's hands and ask ourselves, what's the best way out of this? Thank you.
What an excellent remark to close today's event. And thank you so much. And I think our panelists, Heela John, Horia John, and Jared, you all deserve a big applause from our audience here. And I'm sure we will get a thumb from our viewers on Facebook. So thank you so much. Have a good evening to all. Thank you.